Carja, place names are one of the oldest records a country possesses. They're often not official records, and sometimes they weren't written down until very late, but they are cultural records. Place names loganimnacha in Irish. They preserve things. Language, history, folklore, memory, landscape, belief, duchas, folklore. In Ireland especially, place names matter, because traditionally Irish place names are incredibly descriptive, and they served a purpose. They recorded what the land looked like, who lived there, what happened there, events, what people feared, what people believed about the place. A hill wasn't just a hill, it might be the hill of the gallows, the mountain of the hag, the island of the dead, the ford of the heads. And what's fascinating is that these names often survive longer than anything else. Long after castles collapse, invasions end, communities disappear, or even languages begin to fade under the pressures of colonization, the place name, the loganim, remains. And in Ireland, there are layers upon layers hidden inside those names, because Ireland itself is layered. Invasions, colonization, rebellion, famine, immigration, ancient spirituality, Christianity, belief in the other world, and folk memory. And all of that leaves traces behind, not just in books, but in the landscape itself. The problem is that a lot of this becomes obscured through anglicisation. Names became shortened, misspelled, translated badly, or disconnected completely from their original Irish meaning. And when that happens, the stories hidden inside the names can disappear too. Once you start beginning to understand even a little bit of Gaeilge, a little bit of Irish, and you start looking at older versions of these place names, the landscape in front of you changes completely. Suddenly you realise that a mountain might be tied to ancient burial rituals. A harbour might carry the memory of emigration. That a valley remembered violence. That a road was built during Ungurta Moor. That a place was feared because of disease. Or that a coastline became associated with death. The map of Ireland becomes something very different. Not just geography, but memory. And nowhere is that more obvious than in Ireland's darker place names. Places shaped by death, punishment, suffering, isolation, fear, folklore, and tragedy. Some of these names preserve exact historical memory. Others preserve atmosphere, a feeling attached to a place for so long that eventually it becomes permanent. Carja, you're listening to Undercover Irish, the podcast where we uncover Ireland's hidden curriculum. Today we're exploring more of Ireland's darkest place names, what they reveal about Irish history, Irish belief, Irish trauma, and the extraordinary way memory survives in the landscape. Carja, Oileán le Caillí. Perhaps maybe the oldest, darkest place names in Ireland are the ones connected to death itself. Not violence yet, not punishment, just death. Burial places, funeral routes, ancient landscapes where memory become attached to the dead. Because for most of Irish history, death wasn't hidden away from everyday life. People died at home, funerals travelled on foot, wakes were held in the homestead. Bodies crossed mountains and bog roads. Communities buried generations of their own dead in the same ground for centuries. And because of that, death enters the landscape itself. Take a place like this, for example, a Carja, Oileán na Marbh. the island of the dead. Oileán, meaning island na Marbh of the dead. This is an offshore island near Inishbofin off the Donegal coast, Dún Tír Chonaill. The name feels heavy, it's direct, it's not complicated, it's not symbolic, it's not poetic, it's just the island of the dead, Oileán na Marbh. Places like this were often associated with isolated burials, sometimes unconsecrated burials, sometimes victims of disease, sometimes communities separating dead physically from the living. And on a dangerous Atlantic coastline like Donegal, Dún death was never far away, particularly if you relied upon the sea for your living. Shipwrecks, storms, drownings, and the sea itself becomes part of the memory. Similarly, accordia, you've got Béal Átha na Marbh. Béal Átha na Marbh. So Béal is the mouth, Átha is a ford. This is a shallow crossing. And of course, na Marbh, similarly to Oileán na Marbh, is of the dead. So the approach to the ford of the dead. And that's an incredibly old kind of place name. River crossings mattered massively in older Ireland. Roads converged there, armies crossed there, and trade crossed there as well. And naturally, people died in the region as well through battle, ambushes, accidents, flooding. And somewhere in the distant past, enough death became associated with that crossing that the name remained there long after the original event disappeared from memory. Now, it's worth, in reference to the point made in the introduction, it's worth stopping for a second at Béal Átha na Marbh and acknowledge the point around anglicisation, because when this was anglicised, it became Ballinamara. So Ballinamara loses its meaning completely, whereas Béal Átha na Marbh carries that very dark memory within the landscape. And sometimes the darker landscapes move beyond death itself into mythology, into the other world. Like, for example, Sliabh na Caillí. Sliabh na Caillí or Sliabh na Caillí, the mountain of the hag. This is near Old Castle in County Meath. Today it's famous for passage tombs, one of the oldest ritual landscapes in Ireland, older than the pyramids. And the name connects the mountain to the Caillach, what we would know in modern day as the ancient hag figure, associated with winter, death, storms, wild landscapes, and the old supernatural world of Ireland. At times as well, the Caillach can be less supernatural and can be more of a female figure within the family. And what's fascinating about how seamlessly mythology and death merge together here, the mountain is both a burial landscape and a mythological landscape, a place where the dead and the supernatural overlap and recorded in place name. In accordia, that happens constantly in Irish place names. Death becomes folklore, folklore becomes geography, and geography becomes language. A hill becomes the hill of the hag, an island becomes the island of the dead, and a crossing becomes the ford of the dead. And eventually people stop asking why. But some of Ireland's darkest place names are far more recent than ancient burial landscapes. Because one event that left a particular scar across the Irish map, Ungurta Moor. Ungurta Moor, the Great Hunger, changed Ireland so completely that it's almost impossible to separate modern Ireland from its aftermath, or indeed the diaspora abroad. Millions emigrated and millions dead. Entire villages disappeared, and like every major trauma in Irish history, Ungurta Moor left marks on the landscape, not just in ruined cottages or graveyards, but in place names as well. The clearest examples of this is the idea of a famine road. These were roads that were built under public works, or what sometimes become known as Black 47 roads, especially associated with places like Mayo, Galway, and Connemara. Roads built during the worst years of Ungurtamore as so called relief projects. The logic was brutal. People were starving, but they were forced to work for food or forced to work for a wage that could scarcely afford the rising prices at the time. Breaking stone, digging roads, building routes through mountains and bogland. And many of these roads led nowhere useful. They became known as roads to nowhere. There's something incredibly bleak about that image. Starving people building empty roads through emptying landscapes. And in some places, workers reportedly collapsed where they stood, weak from hunger, exposure, and disease. The road itself becomes part of the suffering, and even today, in parts of the west of Ireland, people still remember certain roads as famine roads. The memory remains attached to the landscape. For many Irish people, Ungurtamore did not end in death, but it ended in departure. Those thousands of refugees fleeing and seeking better situations abroad, and this particular place name speaks directly to that. Port na Long. Port na Long is anglicised from Port na Lung, the port of the ship. Now, originally, this is simply a maritime place name, but after Ungurtamore, harbours and ports across Ireland took on a much darker emotional meaning because they become places of separation. And in the previous episode, we spoke about Gatan Nyori, the Gate of the Tears. This is another example of this, a kind of a dark feeling hanging over places that were associated with the separation and emigration. Families gathering at the shoreline, parents saying goodbye to children, communities watching neighbours leave forever. And as mentioned in the previous episode, for many of these people, there was no expectation of a return. The Atlantic crossing itself became part of Irish trauma, especially on the so-called coffin ships, the overcrowded vessels that carried famine immigrants to America, Canada, Britain, Australia. Disease spread easily on board, and deaths during crossing were common. For many people, the sea became associated with disappearance. And what's striking about how geographical famine memory, Ungurtamore memory, became in Ireland. Roads, ports, workhouses, burial pits. The suffering attached itself physically to the land. Harbours stopped just being harbours or piers. Roads stopped becoming just a road. And even generations later, these places carry emotional weight. That's what place names in Ireland often are. Not descriptions, but emotional memory preserved in language. And the Carja, my friends, where there is hunger, there is also disease. One of the most unsettling things about older societies is how visible disease once was. We're talking about before antibiotics, before modern medicine, and before people even fully understood how infections spread. Illness could shape an entire community, and in Ireland, fear of disease left its own mark on the landscape. Take, for example, a Carja Spidéal or Spidéal, Oscailga in Irish. Now, Spidéal comes from Spidéal, the hospital. This is located in the heart of the Irish-speaking area on Gaeltacht, west of Galway City along the Connemara coast. Today, it's a vibrant Gaeltacht village, but the name itself most likely comes from a medieval hospital or a leper house once located there. And importantly, these hospitals were usually built or placed far away from settlements because medieval society feared disease intensely, as you can imagine. Leprosy especially carried enormous stigma, not just medical fear, but social and even spiritual fear. People suffering from it were often isolated from ordinary society entirely. And so even the geography reflects that separation. The hospital exists out on the edge of the community, and centuries later, the place name still remembers it. That's one of the strangest things about Irish place names, how casually they preserve things that once terrified entire communities. And there's more like that. Misery Hill. This is such a bleak name, Misery Hill. The exact origin of Misery Hill is debated. Some traditions connect it to plague and disease, others to execution or funeral routes or poverty. And in a way, the uncertainty of that makes the name more powerful itself. Because no matter what the explanation is that's correct, they all point towards suffering, and that suffering lives on in the name, Misery Hill. Older cities were far closer to death than modern cities are. We were always very close to a plague outbreak, overcrowding, corpses carried through streets, and disease rapidly spreading in condensed, dense districts. Names like Misery Hill preserve the emotional atmosphere of that world. And what's striking about all of these names is how direct they are. You know, the hospital, or Spidéal, Spidéal, Misery Hill, and of course the island of the dead, Oileán na Marbh. There's no attempt to soften anything or to make it easier to digest. And maybe that directness is part of what makes Irish place names, Lug Animnica, so powerful. They preserve the emotion without trying to overly dramatise it. The fear is already inside the name. But some older place names preserve something harsher still. Not accidental suffering or disease or deliberate violence, but execution, punishment, massacre. Places where fear itself becomes a public spectacle. Now, in the last episode of Corja, we mentioned something that, for most of Irish history, was a punishment, and it was designed to be seen. In other words, executions. We mentioned that these weren't always hidden away behind prison walls, but they happened publicly, on hills, at crossroads, on the edges of town boundaries as warnings, and because of that, violence entered the landscape itself. And the examples we gave were examples like Cnoc na Crithe, the hill of the gallows. These were stark names, not symbolic, not metaphorical. These were places where people were publicly executed. Gallows hills on the edge of settlements, to be clearly visible for everybody. The point was intimidation. It was a visible reminder of authority, of punishment. And it was directed not just against criminals, but rebels, enemies of the state. And in many places, they became displays afterwards to warn of what could happen to you if you rebel. And another one I want to add to that is Páirc na Crithe. Páirc na Crithe. So Gallows Green, or the field of the gallows. So there's a local tradition around Tralee connected to this site, that it's the execution site of White Boys. Now, the White Boys were an agrarian resistance group active during the 18th century, a secret rural society which protested against rents, evictions, and the power of the landlord. And public execution became part of how authorities tried to control this unrest. Again, we have a place name becoming a record of conflict between ordinary people and power. Not official history, but folk memory. Some places preserve violence in an even more visceral way, like Bloody Bridge. Bloody Bridge, what a statement that is. This is near Newcastle at the foot of the Mountains of Mourne, the Mourne Mountains, like the song. Now, according to local tradition, the bridge became associated with killings connected either to 1641 rebellion, which would be around the time of Cromwell in Ireland, or the 1798 Rising, the United Irishmen Rising of Wolfe Tone. Stories say that the river beneath the bridge ran red with blood. Now, historically, the exact details are difficult to fully verify, but that kind of misses the point, because clearly something violent happened and became attached to local memory strongly enough that the landscape itself was renamed. And that's something that Ireland and her people did constantly. History becomes story, story becomes folklore, and eventually folklore becomes geography. Now, not all dark place names began with violence. Sometimes the landscape itself created the fear initially. So we had Bloody Bridge, now take bloody Foreland. Cnoch Folla Ascuelga, Cnoch Folla in Irish, the Hill of Blood. This is on the Atlantic coast just west of Gweedore. Now, despite the name, it probably wasn't named after a massacre. You see, the cliffs glow deep red at sunset, especially in certain Atlantic light. And that dramatic colour most likely created the name originally. Now, over time, other meanings attached themselves to it: shipwrecks, storms, Atlantic drownings, maritime deaths, because the Donegal coast could be extremely dangerous. And this happens repeatedly in Irish place names as well. A dramatic landscape creates a dramatic name, and the generations of memory begin layering stories onto it. And then there are places where fear itself seems built into geography, like the Scalp. The Scalp is a narrow, rocky pass between Enniskerry and South Dublin. Steep cliffs, mist, dense trees, a winding road cutting through stone. And even today it feels slightly ominous. Historically, travellers feared it because of robberies and ambushes. The geography itself made people vulnerable. And even then, there's the name that sounds violent itself, the Scalp. Like the mountain itself had been cut right open. And finally, there's probably no better example of folklore, danger, and atmosphere blending together than Murder Hole Beach. Murder Hole Beach. This is near Downings. Oscuelga, this is known as Ba Íochtar. Ba Íochtar. So it gives you the location. Íochtar Lower. Ba Bay. But it's more commonly known as the Murder Hole. An isolated beach surrounded by cliffs and Atlantic surf. And nobody completely agrees where the name came from. Some stories involve smugglers killing informers, others mention shipwreck victims washing ashore, and others simply point to accidental deaths or dangerous currents because there would be a lot of rip tide currents in the area. And over time, the uncertainty itself again becomes part of the kind of mythology attached to it. This is a really good example of a place name perhaps carrying a warning that comes from a cultural memory, and that cultural memory preserved in place name, passed on to the next generations, warning, foreboding, foreshadowing the next dark occurrence. So, Accordia, we started out on this particular podcast episode, following on from the last one, looking at the darker place names that exist in Ireland, the darker Lug Animnacha. And in other podcast episodes, we've looked at other place names in different contexts as well. Because these are like ongoing conversations between the land and our people. They carry a cultural memory, they carry a historical reminder of the past, and they tell us a little bit more about the landscape and, of course, her people and her history. And I really enjoy putting these episodes together because once you start looking at one and then the next and then the next, you start to see the landscape and her people in a different light completely. This is about rolling back the Anglicization of the country and looking at some of the deeper place names, the real place names, the real meanings, if you like. Accordia, thank you so much for being with me on Undercover Irish. If this is your first, do go back and listen to some previous episodes, Accordia. As always, if you've enjoyed this, please do leave a comment, like and share, or ideally leave a review if you have a minute or two. It does a massive job for pushing the podcast in the algorithm. And Accordia, a massive thank you, a huge Gurv Mila Mahaga to those who support the show on Patreon for the price of a cup of coffee. It really helps with the overheads and time on a week. I'm eternally grateful for that at Carja. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as I have at Carja. Until the next time at Carja, thank you for being with me on Undercover Irish. Gurv Mila Mahagut Asokfelum. Until the next time, Slán go fón ba Carja agus berigi bua.